In episode 2, we left William Law behind after he printed the prospectus of his anti-Joseph Smith newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor. Today, William prints the first and only issue of the paper, and it turns everything upside down. I'm Stephen Detloff, and this is the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast, telling the story of the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. On June 7, 1844, the first and only issue of the Nauvoo Expositor gets printed. And this paper gets printed, and citizens in Nauvoo are furious. The paper attacks Joseph for his morals, for his religious teachings, and for his politics, and perhaps especially the paper attacks Joseph for how all those things blend together. And just so you know how fast everything from here is going to move, the paper again comes out on the 7th of June. Joseph Smith is killed on the 27th. That's in 20 days. We started our story of the death of Joseph Smith with Porter Rockwell in jail in Missouri, being asked by the sheriff to turn Joseph in. That happened in December of 1843, and everything in the first 3 episodes of this story has taken place over 6 months. Now, some of the things that we've referenced and will reference are things that happened in Missouri, which explain how the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints got to Illinois, things like Joseph Smith being in Liberty Jail for treason, and the Latter-day Saints being driven out and attacked by mobs. But that's for context, really. Outside of those flashbacks, the first 3 episodes of our story cover December 1843 through the end of May 1844. It's 6 months. But this act, the printing of the first and only issue of the Nauvoo Expositor, happens 20 days before Joseph's death, and everything from here is downhill very fast. The Nauvoo Expositor is printed, and it's full of poems and satirical stories and has various affidavits and editorials in it. And the paper officially lays out 15 grievances or complaints against Joseph Smith. Now, one of the grievances listed by the newspaper is regarding Joseph's use of habeas corpus as a legal technique. One of the complaints is of Joseph's running for president. Now, surprisingly to me, William Law condemns Joseph Smith for his hostile conduct towards the citizens in Missouri. You'll remember Joseph was run out of Ohio by an armed mob of men, and from Ohio he settled in Missouri and lived there as a free man for 8 months. Only 8 months before Governor Boggs wrote the extermination order. Well, after the extermination order, Joseph lived in Missouri for 6 more months, but that's because he was in prison, in various prisons and jails, or under arrest in different places. So this complaint that Joseph acted hostilely towards the Missourians was a popular complaint of men in Missouri at the time, though, and it's also a popular complaint of the anti-Mormon party in Illinois, who, again, they're trying to align themselves with Joseph's enemies in Missouri. And as a result, these Reformationists that have left the restored Church of Jesus Christ and joined William Law's new church have also decided to take up this complaint. Anti-Mormons felt like the Latter-day Saints should have just run away from their persecutions in Missouri instead of attempting to fight back. They felt like the Latter-day Saints were wrong to try and fight against the mobs that were murdering and raping and attacking them. And at this point, William and members of his secret organization are openly conversing with members of Thomas Sharp's anti-Mormon party. And they're openly conversing and planning with men who are angry with the Latter-day Saints in Missouri. It's no longer there's one group of people fighting Joseph Smith, led by William Law, and another group of people fighting Joseph Smith, led by Thomas Sharp. We kind of have 2 fronts of the same war, and they're starting to share information with each other. Well, another one of the complaints in the newspaper is of Joseph's teaching and practicing of polygamy. Joseph's teaching on polygamy still exists today. It's known within Latter-day Saint scripture as Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. You can go read that online or in the book of scripture, in the Doctrine and Covenants if you're interested. Now, William Law believed almost all of Joseph's visions and revelations and commandments up to polygamy. That was for William one of Joseph's teachings that he could not believe and made him think Joseph was a fallen prophet. But again, that's why, even in the Nauvoo Expositor, the paper written to destroy Joseph Smith and his city, William Law reaffirms that the Book of Mormon is true scripture, and that Joseph Smith used to be a prophet of God, because, remember, William Law, in 1844, is a Reformationist, even though 40 years later, as we quoted in another episode, he regrets ever learning about the religion. So the Nauvoo Expositor lists 15 official complaints against Joseph, but remember, the whole purpose of the Expositor is to get the Nauvoo city charter repealed. So these complaints are all brought up in the context of repeal the city charter. Remember that Nauvoo was a city founded by Latter-day Saint refugees, and they came into Illinois in the dead of winter as strangers and pilgrims. Now, 5,000 members of the restored Church of Jesus Christ had been scattered all across the countryside all over western Illinois. And when Joseph is escaping jail out from Missouri into Illinois, he shows up and meets with the rest of the Latter-day Saints in Illinois, and he says, concerning the land that would later become the city of Nauvoo, quote, the place was literally a wilderness, mostly covered with trees and bushes, but with no more eligible place presenting itself, I considered it wisdom to make an attempt to build a city, end quote. And so Joseph began writing letters to friends and followers, men and women who were scattered across Illinois, to come and settle in this new location so that they could build up a city. When eventually Nauvoo became a city in the eyes of the Illinois state government, when a bill that was written for the incorporation of Nauvoo was approved by the Illinois House, Senate, and the governor. Now, the bill that passed through Congress to make Nauvoo an official city in the eyes of the government gave Nauvoo a city charter. This is a legal document that sets out the rules and laws of the city that's being formed. And the city charter passed through the state Congress pretty easily and without any disagreement, but shortly afterwards, citizens of Illinois began to have problems with it. Now, no one's sure if the lawmakers in Illinois didn't have any problems with the bill when they passed it because they were busy and they didn't read it, or because they knew the Latter-day Saints were already a powerful voting bloc, which they wanted to win over to their side, or if they felt bad for the Latter-day Saint refugees coming from Missouri and wanted to give them favorable city laws so that they would feel safe and protected. Regardless, and maybe it was a mixture of all of those things, but regardless of why they did it, 4 years after the city charter was passed by the Illinois Congress and then signed by the governor, a lot of the citizens in Illinois and a lot of the lawmakers who had passed the bill had problems. And one of the things that the city charter allowed for was the city council of Nauvoo to free anyone who was arrested. One historian writes regarding this effect of the Nauvoo city charter that it was, quote, designed to make Nauvoo an island of legal safety. The net result was not only to help protect the Latter-day Saints from legal persecution, real or imagined, but also to make outside law enforceable in Nauvoo only if the city government concurred, end quote. And the Latter-day Saint refugees looked at this provision as a safety net from continued religious persecution. Because remember, right across the Mississippi River, and a little south from Nauvoo, is Missouri, a state full of people that want to kill Joseph, and a state which is still trying to bring him back west for the attempted assassination of ex-Governor Boggs, even though they'd already dropped the charges against Porter. So while the Latter-day Saints look at this provision as a safety net, their neighbors look at it as a way to harbor criminals. They look at the law as being incapable of reaching men and women who lived inside Nauvoo. People hated the Latter-day Saints for this special provision their city laws provided, and they feared them for it. Now, famously, too, the charter gave the city of Nauvoo its own army, the Nauvoo Legion. Now, the Nauvoo Legion was part of the Illinois state militia, and every city at the time has a militia. In this time period, it was required by the Illinois state constitution that every free, able-bodied man in the state be a member of their city's militia. So the Nauvoo Legion was not a church military, it was the Nauvoo branch of the Illinois state militia. But even though the militia was solely under the direction of the governor of the state, Governor Ford, it was also under the direction of the city mayor for local issues. So because Nauvoo was the largest city in Illinois at the time, and full of Latter-day Saints, it just so happened that its militia and its leaders favored protecting Joseph Smith. So it offered a good deterrent against individuals who wanted to make war against Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints head on. The Nauvoo Legion, in fact, was a big reason that Joseph, with all his enemies in Missouri and Illinois, was safe in the city of Nauvoo to begin with and hadn't been killed to begin with. But the Nauvoo branch of the state militia was granted special powers and abilities through the city charter that other militias did not have. For example, the Nauvoo Legion was allowed to be used as a police force by the mayor, whereas other militias were not. And so again, the Latter-day Saints looked at this provision given to them by their city charter as something that brought them safety after their decade of persecution. Their neighbors, who took pity on them when they first showed up and allowed the city of Nauvoo to have that provision, now look on it with fear and anger, and they're probably regretting they did it. They look on the Nauvoo city charter as something evil that the Latter-day Saints had written so that they could, build up an army and attack other people. So William Law with the Nauvoo Expositor is hoping that by taking away the Nauvoo city charter, you take away Joseph's role as mayor, you take away his city council, you take away his role as lieutenant governor of the Nauvoo Legion, you take away the city council's ability to get anyone out of being arrested through habeas corpus, you take away the Nauvoo Legion itself and its state-issued weapons and its ability to act as a police force. So then a city, which was an island of defense for the prophet and his followers, all of a sudden becomes a place anyone can easily walk into and take out the prophet and have him killed. So the Nauvoo City Expositor is printed, and the very next day the Nauvoo City Council meets. It's on a Saturday, and they meet about the paper. They're trying to figure out what to do about it. It's disrupting the peace of their city. They don't make any decisions, though. It's a Friday, so they take the weekday off, and 2 days later on a Monday, the city council meets again. Joseph Smith, as mayor of Nauvoo, is also in the city council meeting, and the people there are discussing how to react to the paper. But they're also discussing in a bigger picture how this paper is the latest in a long string of attacks from the paper's publishers. So the city council begins to recount all of the times that William Law and his partners have made efforts or made threats to kill Joseph Smith in the past. There is for sure one failed attempt at murder prior to this paper being published. There was a time when a man by the name of Foster pulled a gun on Joseph Smith and stuck it right to his belly. Luckily, Porter Rockwell is there at the time, and Porter jumped in front of the gun and wrestled it out of Foster's hand. Foster was a business partner of William Law's. He was one of the Nauvoo Expositor's publishers, and he was a member of William Law's New Religion and William's secret organization. So there's a history of William Law and his friends publicly and privately trying to attack Joseph Smith inside Nauvoo. Now this discussion at the city council slowly turns to not only looking at the Nauvoo Expositor as the most recent instance of William Law's persecution against Joseph, but as the most recent instance of all the persecution against all the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints since its inception. One of the councilmen reminds everyone of the massacre at Haun's Mill back in Missouri. He says, quote, "My son laid there dead in Haun's Mill for 2 days before he could be put in a coffin." End quote. He said, quote, "I cannot sit here with the same murderous spirit that was raging in Missouri and do nothing. Whatever we do, the quicker the better." End quote. Haun's Mill was a Latter-day Saint settlement in Missouri. In October of 1833, during the height of the Latter-day Saints being persecuted in Missouri, a mob marched on the settlement and massacred 17 of the people there. They killed men and women and children. 2 days before the massacre, a group of Latter-day Saints stopped at Haun's Mill. This group was traveling through from Kirtland, Ohio. And to me, this just sets the tone of this council meeting and is a good case in point for our entire story of persecution up to now. So in this instance, a group of Latter-day Saint pioneers are fleeing from religious persecution on the American frontier. They're moving from danger to safety, from Ohio to Missouri. And they finally get to safety in Missouri, but instead of finding safety, they immediately find themselves in the middle of a massacre. You can imagine how demoralizing that would be. It would make you feel hopeless, and it would be frustrating, and that's what they're all feeling. These members of the Restored Church of Jesus Christ feel like they can't be in Ohio, they can't be in Missouri, now they can't be in Illinois. And Joseph is running for president to try and get their property back and their land back, and the Nauvoo City Charter protects them. They have their own militia. They're trying to get the federal government to allow them to gather an army to escort them out to Oregon. All these things the Latter-day Saints are doing to try and protect themselves, and they're all being interpreted by their enemies as attacks or as warning signs of an impending attack or impending danger. Another councilman in this meeting talks about the other Missouri persecutions that went on. He's still angry about what happened at Far West and reminds everyone of the persecution there. We've talked about how Joseph was taken into custody at Far West. Well, for months before he was arrested there, Latter-day Saints in the city and surrounding areas were shot at and whipped, and they had their property burned. Things were stolen. They suffered all sorts of persecutions there and in the counties round about. It was shortly after the Haun's Mill massacre that Joseph Smith was thrown in Richmond jail, and from there directly into Liberty Jail. And shortly after Liberty Jail, he was allowed to escape into Illinois. So the persecution at Far West and Haun's Mill and all of Missouri are still a very large part of the psyche of these religious refugees, these Latter-day Saints living in Nauvoo. Joseph reads to the city council, the section of the Expositor paper where it says that they want to repeal the city's charter. And Joseph says, quote, "Is it not treasonable against all chartered rights and privileges and against the peace and the happiness of this city?" End quote. Joseph's brother Hiram, who's in the meeting, says, quote, "Yes, it is treasonable. We should burn the press and pie the type." End quote. Hiram tells everyone there that they already have this Warsaw Signal newspaper printing all this anti-Mormon stuff 17 miles south of Nauvoo. He tells them that one is enough and they don't need another anti-Mormon paper right in the city. Well, everyone is on board to destroy the press except for one man. His name is Counselor Warrington. He's not a Latter-day Saint, by the way. He wants to simply fine the Expositor for every libel that's printed, but no one else wants to. They think it would be ineffectual. They just want the press destroyed. So the city council passes an ordinance that labels any publication which uses libel as a tool to excite the public mind against a chartered city a nuisance. Now, at the time, the rights in the U.S. Constitution did not apply to the states. So where it says in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, at the time that law only applied to the U.S. Congress or the federal government. It wasn't until 1925 that freedom of the press and freedom of speech in the United States Constitution extended to the states. However, the Illinois state constitution at the time does protect people's freedom of speech, and it does protect the freedom of the press as well. It says that men and women in the state are allowed to, quote, publish as they please, end quote. However, it adds that they, quote, must be answerable both to the community and the individual, end quote. So it's the fact that there wasn't much case law at the time that addressed this area of freedom of the press, and this sentence in the Illinois Constitution that where it says, quote, that those who publish papers must be answerable to the community, end quote, that the city council decides that their ordinance labeling the expositor as a nuisance is best for the city to protect them from a growing spirit of mobocracy. So based on this ordinance, Joseph Smith, then as mayor of the city, orders the city marshal to, quote, destroy the press, pie the type, and burn all libelous handbills found inside, end quote. Applying the type just meant that they would take the boxes of type and dump them out in the road and mix all the pieces up so that it would be difficult for someone to go and pick up the letters by hand and immediately start to use them for printing again. Obeying the orders, the city marshal, J.P. Green, gathered a group of men and marched through the streets of Nauvoo to the expositor's printing office. And it was in all this discussion about the Nauvoo Expositor Press that Joseph Smith presciently said, quote, I would rather die tomorrow and have the thing smashed than live and have it go on, end quote. It's nighttime, and the city is dark. The city marshal is walking at the front of a group of men carrying torches. Behind the men with torches, a group of 200 citizens follow behind to watch and see what's going to happen. The men stop in front of a 2-story brick building, the Nauvoo Expositor printing offices. The marshal knocks on the door and he tells them to open up. The bottom floor of the 2-story building is home to one of the newspaper investors, Francis Higbee. This is the same Francis Higbee who was swearing everyone into their oaths to the destruction of Joseph Smith at that secret meeting in William Law's house that we talked about in episode 2. Francis Higbee, like William Law, was also a person who just left the Restored Church of Jesus Christ after becoming disaffected with Joseph Smith. Francis came from a family who experienced and survived all of the persecution in Missouri, actually. We talked in episode 1 about how the first settlement the Latter-day Saints were kicked out of in Missouri was Independence in Jackson County. Well, the Higbees were some of the settlers of Independence, and they were one of the families who, in the middle of the night, swam across the Missouri River to the safety of the county over while their property was being looted. Francis's father, Judge Higbee, is dead at the time of the printing of the Nauvoo Expositor, but before that, Judge Higbee was a great friend to the prophet Joseph Smith. And now, Judge Higbee's 2 sons are leaders in William Law's New Reformation Church, and they were also leaders in William Law's secret organization bent on destroying Joseph. And I say this again to bring back up that what we talked about in episode 2, that this young Latter-day Saint religion, as far as its members go, is in a near constant state of change. People convert to the religion, they apostatize from it, people are persecuted in it for years, and they struggle through and survive the persecutions, only to then leave the church and persecute the very people amongst whom they used to find strength and comfort. Anyway, J.P. Green, the city marshal, is at the front of the group of men there, followed by curious bystanders, and he knocks on Francis's door, demanding that he open up the printing press. And he shows him through the window the just-written city ordinance that classified the Nauvoo Expositor as a nuisance, and he shows him the second order from the mayor, which, based on that city ordinance, demands the press's destruction. Well, Francis Higbee says he will not open the door for Marshal Green, and so the marshal tells the men to force the door. So 10 men break off from the group, and they march up at the outside stairs that lead to the second floor of this building. At the front of the line, probably second in line, is Porter Rockwell. And the men get up and they try the door and it's locked. So the man next to Porter hauls back and he knees it in. The door swings open and the men walk across the room. Now Francis downstairs hears this and he's furious. He hears the door get kneed in and he hears these men walking around upstairs. And he busts outside and runs up the stairs and he is screaming, quote, all I want to live for is to see the city sunk down to the lowest hell, and by God it shall, end quote. This curse he's screaming is, of course, in reference to the expositor's main goal, which is to repeal the city charter of Nauvoo. He probably wants to see the city actually destroyed too. But Higbee swears that he will shoot Joseph Smith and all that pertain to him, and he's screaming all this while the men are quietly going about their work upstairs. They're gathering up the printed papers and carrying them down, and they're carrying the boxes of type downstairs into the street, and they're doing it quietly and orderly in the same way that a police raid would confiscate things from a crime scene. Well, then the men start tearing apart the printing press. They brought tools to do it with, and they start to carry the dismantled press downstairs. And Francis can't stop them because he's outnumbered, so he's just standing there shouting at them. and he shouts, quote, "Before 10 suns shall go over our heads, the temple, the Nauvoo house, and the mansion shall all be destroyed. It will be the total downfall of this community." The men quietly carry all these things downstairs, and they start a fire in the streets, and they throw the papers in a fire and burn them, and they throw the printing press too in the fire. And the box of type or printing letters doesn't get thrown in the fire, but it gets pied. And so the press is gone, and everyone reconvenes to meet up for a kind of debriefing. The meeting is in front of Joseph's house, the Nauvoo mansion. Joseph Smith is standing on the steps there next to the town marshal, and he's facing the crowd of men and onlookers who just carried out his orders. And Joseph tells the men that he doesn't care how many papers are printed which told the truth, but he will not submit to have another libelous publication in the city. He tells all the men that they've done a good job and that they've executed the orders which were given them by the city council. And the crowd then erupts into a cheer. They say hip hip hooray over and over again, and all go back home. The night the press is destroyed, William Law comes back to his house. He was out of town that day. He comes home and finds his wife, who tells him that their printing press has been destroyed. William immediately decides to put on a good face and let everyone know that he isn't scared of them. So he takes one of his business partners, and they ride through the street at night, and they ride on their horses right up to the printing press, and they walk their horses over the type that has been pied in the street and right by the remains of the press which has been set on fire. That night, however, perhaps revealing his true feelings, he goes home and packs, and the very next morning he and his wife and his children have moved. They move across the Mississippi River into Iowa, and they move into a hotel and then until they can find a home. Almost everyone that's involved with the printing press leaves town except for Francis Higbee. He stays back in Nauvoo to try and settle business matters and take care of the partner's property. Part of settling business matters is the inevitable lawsuit. Francis Higbee sues Joseph Smith, and he sues him in Carthage, Illinois. So that's where the case is going to be heard. 2 days after the Nauvoo Expositor press is destroyed, a constable from Carthage shows up with an arrest warrant. And the arrest warrant demands that Joseph be brought before the judge who wrote the warrant in Carthage or before some other justice of the peace. And Joseph tells the constable that there's no way he's going to Carthage because everyone there wants him dead. Everyone on the way there wants him dead, and he'll go to court in Nauvoo. And the constable tells him back, quote, "I'll be damned, but I will carry you to Carthage before Judge Morrison, who issued the writ," end quote. So Joseph has his close friend Willard Richards, also a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and also the clerk for the local municipal court, write a legal document called habeas corpus that will allow Joseph to appear before a judge in Nauvoo instead of a judge in Carthage. And Joseph goes to court that very day, and the plaintiff Francis Higbee is right there, front and center. And so Joseph appears before a judge, and the trial focuses on whether or not Joseph Smith was inciting a mob or inciting a riot to destroy the press, or whether the press was actually destroyed by a posse under the direction of the city marshal, as ordered by the city council and the mayor. So the testimonies in court in this trial are based on the behavior of the posse. Were they angry? Were they shouting? Were they unruly like a mob? And remember, there's over 200 people there who had followed the posse to watch. There's all these witnesses. They all say that the posse that destroyed the press behaved quietly and orderly. They all bear witness that the only person who was yelling and shouting was, in fact, Francis Higbee. So the judge finds Joseph Smith, the defendant, not guilty for inciting a riot to destroy the destruction of the property of the plaintiffs. So people in Hancock County, remember this is where Nauvoo and Carthage are, in Hancock County, they're furious. Joseph didn't go to Carthage for trial or court. He was proven innocent in a court in Nauvoo, and so mobs start to form again. In Carthage, a mob gathers and resolves to, quote, "utterly exterminate the wicked and abominable Latter-day Saint leaders, the author of our troubles," end quote. They demand that a, quote, "war of extermination should be waged to the entire destruction," end quote, of the Latter-day Saints. Well, the mobs start bringing in cannons and weapons and ammunition from Missouri in preparation for their extermination. Some people, too, from Missouri are crossing the Mississippi River into Illinois because they've been trying to kill Joseph Smith for years now, and they want to finally get it done. And they see that the atmosphere and the time is right, so they're going to come into Nauvoo or to come into Illinois to try and make their final move. So a friend of Joseph's tells him that he needs to go before a county judge, and that by hopefully going to trial again, all of the excitement and anger of people will calm down, because they're mad that Joseph got off of destroying the Nauvoo Expositor press. In fact, the mobs are so angry and are so intent on exterminating the Latter-day Saints that Hiram writes a letter to Brigham Young that he needs to get all the other members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and come back to Nauvoo. Because remember, Brigham Young and these men are still out east trying to get Joseph Smith elected for president. Remember, only 2 of the 12 members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles are left in Nauvoo. Willard Richards, who was Joseph's secretary, and John Taylor, who was Joseph's campaign manager and editor of the Nauvoo newspaper. Well, Hiram tells Brigham in his letter that they, quote, are not frightened, but think it is best to be prepared for the onset of mob attacks, end quote. He tells Brigham, quote, if it is extermination, extermination it is, end quote. So, at the advice of his friend, Joseph goes to court again, and this time Joseph Smith himself stands up as the prosecuting lawyer, is questioning a witness, and objects to the questioning. Joseph claims that this trial is to see if individuals, himself and other members of the city council, incited a riot or a mob. And he says it shouldn't be that way. Joseph says that because they are acting as a city council, the question shouldn't be whether they started a mob, but whether or not the ordinance they passed, labeling the Nauvoo Expositor a nuisance, was legal or not. Joseph says that they shouldn't be tried as individuals, but tried as an entire city council unit. And the judge agrees with Joseph Smith. The judge says that in that regards, the plaintiffs haven't presented a claim, and so Joseph is discharged and everyone walks again. Well, Joseph getting off the first time infuriated the mobs, but Joseph getting off the second time tips them over the edge. And we talked a lot in the last episode about the roles that newspapers were playing in Joseph's presidential election. Well, they're playing just as big a role in public reaction to one of their peers being destroyed, Thomas Sharp. Thomas Sharp in the Warsaw Signal writes that war and extermination are now inevitable. He urges men to make their own comments on the matter with powder and balls. In conjunction with the Warsaw Signal's Führer, a large meeting in Warsaw gets up, and they say that it's just a matter of time before these people come for our anti-Mormon paper. News even gets back to them that Hiram, in that city council meeting, was talking about the Warsaw Signal when they chose to destroy the Nauvoo Expositor press. So now everyone that lives in Warsaw knows that their newspaper is on the minds of church leaders and of Nauvoo's city council members. And they're scared that the Latter-day Saints are going to come destroy their press now. Well, while the Warsaw Signal is arguing for extermination, the Nauvoo Neighbor is publishing from the other side. They said, quote, let us enjoy our religion, rights, and peace like the rest of mankind. Why start presses to destroy rights and privileges and bring upon us mobs to plunder and murder, end quote. But things have moved too far past the point of calmness now. Thomas Sharp's Warsaw Signal had just printed just a week before the Nauvoo Expositor was published that they would not be surprised to hear of Joseph Smith's death by violent means in a short time. They said that he had deadly enemies and that the feeling of the country would break forth in fury upon the slightest provocation. Well, Joseph and church leaders thought that the publication of the Nauvoo Expositor would be the slightest provocation that set off the chain of violence against them. But they never let it get that far. So it turns out that it was the destruction of the press and then the subsequent getting out of 2 charges that was the provocation which set off violence against them. But no one's attacking the Latter-day Saints or Nauvoo because the Nauvoo militia's there. Citizen committees are being formed in Warsaw and Carthage to do in the prophet, but they can't get into Nauvoo to get to the prophet. A year and a half after Joseph's death, the governor of Illinois is writing up his account of all these events to present to the Illinois Congress. And in that write-up, he says regarding this time, quote, no leading man of either party could be arrested without the aid of an army, as individuals of both parties were justly afraid of surrendering for fear of being murdered, end quote. And no one wants to get up an army and go against the Nauvoo Legion because they're the largest militia in the area. But Thomas Sharp and the Warsaw mob see a way to start attacking the Latter-day Saints immediately, if not indirectly, because not all of them live in Nauvoo or inside the city limits. A lot live in the suburbs or in the outskirts of Nauvoo. So they go around to these Latter-day Saints living in the suburbs and start taking their weapons, and they give them a few days to leave. They say, either you leave or we're going to come back and burn your houses and take your stuff. So people on the outskirts of Nauvoo are getting kicked out of their houses. Their weapons are being stolen. They're moving into Nauvoo proper. The Latter-day Saints are refugees again. Kicked out of Ohio, kicked out of Missouri, and now kicked out of the Illinois countryside into Nauvoo. Thomas Sharp and the Warsaw mob tell these refugees to give Joseph Smith a message that unless he gives himself up, they're going to burn Nauvoo to the ground. On the next episode of the podcast, Joseph becomes so concerned with the reports he's hearing about Latter-day Saints being attacked that he declares martial law. Scripts of each podcast episode can be found at our website, www.pilgrimspodcast.com. Music for this episode is from the song Carthage Waltz. It was written and recorded by Michael Hinckley, and the dialogue was written and recorded by myself, Stephen Detloff.